My name is Chris Knipe, and I am an interactive designer with the Wall Street Journal currently. I've only been there about 1 year. Before that, I was a student. I finished graduate school at the University of Missouri in the fall of 2010. And as a student, I interned for both the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and so that's how I ended up with my job. I was very lucky to get those internships and to end up where I'm at. As I said, I've been at my job for about 1 year, so I'm kind of finding my way into the newsroom, into the world of interactive design for a newspaper. I do interactive design. My title is interactive designer, and I design. I do some actual design where I design projects in Photoshop and build mock-ups of interactive projects, such as slideshows or interactive packages for stories that would involve maybe several pieces. And I design like navigation and kind of how the stories will be packaged on the page. I think that I'm struck by how similar things look. Somebody showed me a website yesterday. I don't remember the name of the paper, but it's a Russian newspaper that looks almost exactly like the Wall Street Journal. Yeah, which is funny, and I don't know if that means that. I mean, it's obviously there's. I think that newspaper websites all end up looking a lot alike in some way, and that's because I think as innovations are made, people kind of copy each other's styles because they copy what works, and so you start to see things like slideshows and navigation. You start to see things organized the same way on the newspaper website with a big main news placement on the front page of the site with several stories down, and then like a navigation belt similar to like what the New York Times has, where you have 4 or 5 stories and you can like slide across and see several stories and then more content down below. And that's almost universal. Like that's American newspapers, that's European newspapers, that's Russian newspapers, that's everywhere. Like that's major newspapers all over the world right now kind of follow the same template. So I think that that's very interesting to see how styles kind of proliferate. One of the things I'm going to try to teach this week is the user experience and being very conscious of how you design stories for the web and the way that they guide the user through the story, and the way that when you read stories for online, you're trying to package things in sort of bite-sized pieces. So if you have long-form content, you're trying to package it in a way that it's not just 3,000 words of text in a big block on the page, because that scares people away. You make it navigatable so that it happens in sections, and that you have that you have photos and you have charts and you have things that draw people into a story, and you have timelines and video, and all of these things sort of work to invite people into a story and to guide them through and to give them a sense of the experience before they really even get into it. The other thing is that this is the other point that I hope I get across today, because it's something that I think a lot about, is that we get very hung up, especially in journalism school, when we're trying to learn all of this stuff. We're trying to wrestle with the question of what does this mean, and how do you learn how to do video, and how do you learn programming, and how do you incorporate this all into a package, and that the thing that you can't lose sight of is that all of this is in the service of telling the story. Like, for everything that's changed in journalism and the way that we publish, the thing that hasn't changed is the basic goal, which is to report the news and to give people context and to tell a story. So whatever it is you're doing, it's always about the same thing, which is just simply telling a story. The way that it was proposed to me to do this big lecture is that we had like 2 long sessions, and I was supposed to come up with something to talk about. And the thing that got me excited was just the chance to kind of go through all of the different versions of newspapers that are happening right now, and different designs that do different things, and just different trends that are happening. And so I sort of broke out into several categories of newspapers, where you have like the major newspapers like you listed, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and these kind of big traditional like general news sites. And then there's like this interesting crop of other news sites that are happening. Sites like Gawker, which is it's kind of this gossipy, like it's a tabloid basically on the web. It's a lot of celebrity news and just kind of like very opinionated and very what is the word you would use? It's very snarky. Do you know the word snarky? It's like a lot of attitude, but it's interesting because it's written in this way that's like it's very short. It's got a very strong voice, and it's updated constantly. Like every 10 minutes, there's a new post on the site during the day, and it gets a lot of traffic. And it's this thing that like you get strangely addicted to. And I think that that's a very interesting model. And there's a couple of other that are similar, like the Daily Beast, which is an offshoot of Newsweek magazine. Like so, this very like stalwart, institutional news magazine, which has now like sort of been transformed into something much more kind of gossipy and kind of an aggregate of lots of other stories. They kind of pull in a lot of other journalism and talk about other journalism. So I think those are interesting models. And then I think thirdly, there's a lot of like nonprofit news organizations that are cropping up right now, and that's going to be very interesting to see how those develop. Sites like the Voice of San Diego, which is a nonprofit in San Diego, California. There's a site in New York called ProPublica, which is an investigative like data news organization, and they partner with a lot of other news organizations to publish their stories. And it's something that like it's brand new, and it's very interesting, and it's going to be very interesting to see how these things develop going forward. Presidential election happens every 4 years. Congressional elections happen every 2 years. And so the state of the art of election maps evolves in these like every 2 years, like something new happens, especially for a presidential election. Like 2000, the difference between 2004 and 2008 in the way that newspapers were able to make interactive election maps. Things that like updated live on election night with like it's 8 o'clock on election night and results are coming in, and you can see like county by county the number of votes for different candidates all across the country. It's incredible, right? But it's evolved, and it was incredible when it happened in 2004, and then in 2008 the New York Times introduces like all of these kind of new ways to visualize this information and to show like this last year there was this great innovation where they had like these arrows that pointed different directions, red and blue, on the map to show how much each county or each precinct had changed in their persuasion for Democrat or Republican. And so this year it'll be interesting. It'll be something new. And I know that we're trying to figure out how to render maps. It's something that is very it's a lot of work for most browsers to load, so we're trying to figure out, we're going to do it a different way than we have done it in the past. I think previously we used a Google Maps API, and this year we're going to use a separate Maps library. And then the last part about that is the data side of it, which is something that was a complete mystery to me before I started at the Journal, and I understand it much better now. And the basic way that it works, the reason that news organizations can do these live updates on election night is that they all get their information from the same source, and that same source is the Associated Press. So the Associated Press are sort of the keepers of all of the data. They keep, as the data comes in on election night from all of the local precincts all across the country, they compile all of these numbers and they upload it very quickly, and they get it out in a way that everybody can access. So it's an API, which means that it's JSON data. It's data that you can just point a graphic at, and you know what it's going to look like ahead of time. And so you can build your project with like kind of fake data that they give you going into it. So you have lots of time to prepare. Then on election night, like you already know what everything's going to look like. You know how it's structured, and if you've done your work correctly, it's magical to watch this thing populate, on election night as like the real data begins to come in. The first part of that is that you have to get up to speed to be able to actually do the work. You have to learn how to write code, and you have to learn how to design like interactive projects, because if you don't know how to do that, you can't design things the way that you want them. And so what's magical is when you get good enough that you can actually design things the way that you imagine them. You're not limited by what you know how to do. If you know how to do a whole lot, you can start to do things that are much more involved and much more creative, and it's something that I see in my colleagues a lot. People who have been doing this for a long time, people who are much better programmers than I, who are just doing amazing work, and that's like what I hope to get to at some point, is like to be good enough as a programmer to really to really branch out and to kind of stretch out into like more and more creative work. So. We have in the last year, I can tell you that we've hired several people into a social media team. I think there was one person when I started that I knew of anyway, who was the main social media person for the Wall Street Journal, and I think now there's 5 or 6, and we kind of keep adding people, and that's very interesting. They work with reporters and they work with editors to promote stories, but it's also very much about reader engagement. And I think social media is it's interesting because it's this word that like people I think have different ideas of what it means. And I think certainly I hadn't really thought about it before I was at the Journal. I didn't really understand how social media really can like be a huge part of what a newspaper does. And I think that what I've learned about it is that it's very much about reader engagement. It's not just about sending things out into the world. It's also about getting feedback. And the second part of that is it's the way that news travels. People seek out individual news sources, and you sort of tend to gravitate towards things that you know and things that you like. And if you don't have another way that things come at you, you end up with this very narrow viewpoint. And what social media can do is it can send stories out in a way that people come across things that they normally wouldn't, and it's very powerful for that reason. I ended up in this field in a weird way. I started as a musician, and as a musician I designed a lot of like posters and CDs, and so I ended up doing design, and then I ended up doing my job as it is now because I was a journalist. I wanted to be a journalist, but I had this background in design, and so this kind of all came together. And I think that if they're related, it's all part of composition in some way. It's all part of this creative composition and this idea of building something and building it creatively. And a lot of the same things that I love about music, that I love about being in a band and being with other musicians, are the same things that I love about working as a creative team in a newspaper and being a part of a team like with other very talented people and getting to work on projects together. So if they're related, I think that's how